In 1859, Alabama, a mistress who thrived on cruelty was forced into something so unthinkable it was erased from history books. Not by war, but by the very man she believed powerless. His revenge shattered her world, turned into legend. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from history's shadows. Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments, do you believe this was justice or horror? The year was 1859, and Alabama simmered with more than just the heat. The Civil War had not yet begun, but tension pressed down like the summer air, thick, suffocating, and heavy with the unspoken knowledge that change was coming. Plantations dotted the countryside like islands of wealth and cruelty, each one standing as a monument to cotton, blood, and silence. Life on these sprawling estates followed a rhythm older than memory. At dawn, the fields filled with the sound of hoe blades striking soil, of calloused hands pulling cotton from its thorny husks. Overseers barked orders with the indifference of men who thought themselves gods, their whips cracking not only against skin, but against dignity itself. Every day blurred into the next chained together by hunger, labor, and survival. At the center of one such plantation stood a grand house, its whitewashed columns rising like pillars of pride. To passing travelers, it might have looked idyllic. Magnolia trees shading the front lawn, the smell of honeysuckle drifting on the breeze, a piano's soft notes echoing from the parlor on Sunday evenings. But those who lived beneath its roof knew that the beauty was only a mask. Behind its heavy doors lay a silence filled with dread, and a mistress whose gentility existed only when eyes were upon her. The mistress of the house was a woman of both refinement and ruthlessness. Outwardly, she embodied Southern gracer gowns imported from New Orleans, her posture straight as the Bible she carried to church. But inside those walls, her voice was sharp, her temper cruel, her pride insatiable. She demanded obedience, not just from the enslaved, who kept her household running, but from anyone who dared enter her shadow. To her, kindness was weakness, and power was her only shield against the world. Yet this was not a prosperous household, not anymore. The family's fortune had begun to fray, the fields not as bountiful as in decades past. The whispers of debt gnawed at her husband's reputation, and so she clung harder to the only power she still controlled, the lives of those bound in chains beneath her. Among them was a man who carried himself differently from the others. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and silent in a way that unnerved her. Where others kept their eyes low, he sometimes looked at her, not with defiance exactly, but with a steady watchfulness she could not abide. He was not ignorant. He was not afraid. And she despised him for it. In the evenings, after the fields lay quiet and lanterns flickered in the quarters, the mistress would pace her halls, listening to the creaks of the old house and the rustle of insects against the window screens. She could not silence the thought that one day her control might slip. That fear burrowed deep inside her, though she would never admit it aloud. For now, the balance of power held. She was the mistress, he the enslaved. She gave orders, and he obeyed. But history remembers a different ending, because in that long, hot year of 1859, beneath the magnolias and the weight of a decaying empire, one act of vengeance would shatter the fragile order of her world and leave a legacy of horror that would echo long after the cotton fields had turned to dust. Cruelty, in the mistress's hands, was never an accident. It was deliberate, sharpened like a blade, and polished until it gleamed. She ruled the household not with love or fairness, but with fear, and she wore that fear like a necklace, proud of the way it glimmered in the eyes of those who served her. To the world outside her plantation gates, she was the very picture of refinement. At Sunday service, she held her hymnal with delicate fingers, her voice rising in pious harmony. She donated to the parish, hosted luncheons for neighboring families, and spoke of Christian duty with solemn conviction. But those who lived under her roof knew the truth. Her prayers ended at the church doors. Once home, she discarded righteousness like a shawl and wrapped herself in spite. She found endless ways to remind the enslaved of their place. Sometimes it was with words, whispered daggers that cut deeper than a whip. "You're nothing without me. Even your breath is mine to give or take." Other times it was with humiliation so small and constant they could not be forgotten, forcing one of the women to polish her shoes as she wore them, ordering another to fan her for hours as she slept in the afternoon heat. Even meals became theater. She would dine on silver platters while instructing her servants to watch, savoring their hunger like a fine dessert. But her favorite target, the one she seemed to reserve her sharpest cruelty for, was the broad-shouldered man whose silence unnerved her. He did not cower the way she wanted. He did not flinch as quickly as the others. And that quiet strength infuriated her. She made him perform tasks that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with humiliation. She once forced him to kneel on the gravel drive until his knees bled, simply because she said he did not bow low enough when she passed. One evening, in front of a visiting neighbor, she called him forward and asked him to recite a prayer. When he stumbled, his voice low with shame, she laughed, a cruel ringing sound that made the guest shift uncomfortably in his chair. But the mistress didn't stop there. She mocked him, twisting scripture into a weapon. "Perhaps the Lord refuses to hear the words of a savage," she said, her smile sweet as honey, but her eyes sharp with malice. That moment burned like a brand across the plantation. The other enslaved men and women kept their eyes low, but the silence that followed her laughter was heavy. Everyone felt the shift. Her cruelty wasn't just discipline anymore. It was sport. And sport can be dangerous when the prey learns how to fight back. Her husband rarely interfered. He saw her temper as a trivial matter, something for the household to endure. If anything, he admired her iron hand. "A plantation must be run with order," he would say, sipping his brandy, blind to the line between order and abuse. And so her tyranny flourished unchecked, growing bolder with each passing season. The mistress believed herself untouchable. To her, cruelty was not a risk, but a privilege proof that she was above consequence. She never imagined that each act of humiliation, each word dripping with venom, was a thread unraveling the fragile fabric of her safety. Because cruelty, when repeated enough, does not just wound, it awakens something in the wounded. And the man she sought to break was not crumbling. He was waiting. For years he endured, silent, steady, bearing each insult as though it slid past him, though inside it settled like stones at the bottom of a well. But by the summer of 1859, the stones had piled too high. The well was nearly full. At first, his defiance was almost invisible, hidden in the smallest cracks of obedience. He worked the fields, yes, but a little slower. He carried her parcels, but set them down with a firmness that bordered on insolence. When she barked an order, he would pause for a heartbeat before obeying. It was nothing she could punish outright, but she felt it. She felt it in the way he moved, in the way his eyes lingered too long, in the faint suggestion that he was no longer entirely hers to command. The other enslaved men and women noticed too. Around the fires at night, when voices dropped to whispers, they spoke of him. Some feared for him, knowing the lash would be merciless if she sensed rebellion. Others dared to hope he might become more than a symbol of defiance. He might become a spark. On plantations like this, sparks were dangerous. They could smolder for months unseen, then ignite with a fury that no overseer's whip could extinguish. The mistress, of course, noticed. She had always prided herself on sensing weakness in others, but now she sensed something else, strength. It unsettled her. She tried to break it down with harsher punishments. She made him chop wood until his palm split and bled. She sent him into the fields long after sunset, knowing the snakes stirred in the tall grass. She even had him whipped, not for disobedience, but for what she called insolence of the eyes. Still, he endured. Each punishment left scars, but scars are not just wounds. They are reminders. And his body, marked and weathered, carried those reminders like armor. One night, as the crickets shrilled and the air hung damp with the promise of rain, he sat alone outside the quarters, staring at the great house that loomed against the moonlight. The others slept fitfully, exhausted from the day's toil, but his eyes stayed open. He thought of the years behind him, the years ahead, the endless chain of cruelty with no end but death. And in that moment, something shifted. Endurance was no longer enough. The next morning, when the mistress ordered him to kneel before her and scrub the steps with bare hands, he did as told. But when she struck him across the back with a riding crop for not moving fast enough, he did not cry out. He looked up at her, and though his lips did not part, his eyes spoke words he had never dared. "You will not own me forever." That look rattled her more than any scream would have. She turned sharply, retreating into the house, her composure cracking for the briefest moment. She felt it, the tremor of power slipping, the faint echo of control fading. But fear rarely makes the cruel gentler. Instead, it made her more dangerous. She vowed to crush him completely, to remind him that even the thought of rebellion was a sin she would burn from his soul. She never realized that in trying to break him, she had already created the very thing she feared most. Because a man with nothing left to lose is a man who cannot be chained. The night it happened was like any other, or so it seemed. The summer air hung heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth after a brief afternoon storm. The cicadas droned, the lanterns flickered in the big house, and the mistress walked the halls with her usual restless steps. But she did not sense the shift, the quiet gravity pulling her toward her undoing. The man had waited patiently, carrying his rage like a sealed jar, never letting it spill until the moment was right. And tonight, with the house hushed and her husband away on business, the jar cracked open. It began with silence. She entered her parlor, expecting to find it just as she had left it, the faint glow of candles, her Bible resting neatly on the table, the piano keys catching the shimmer of moonlight through lace curtains. But she felt it first, a presence. Someone was there. When she turned, he stood in the doorway. His posture was still, his gaze steady. For the first time, she felt the difference between being mistress of the house and being prey. "Why are you here?" she demanded, voice sharp, brittle. She expected him to lower his eyes, to stammer, to explain. He did not. He simply stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until the distance between them was closed. What followed was not chaos, but something far more terrifying. Control. He did not strike her down in anger. He did not scream. He commanded, and she, for the first time in her life, obeyed. Piece by piece, he stripped away the trappings of her power. He made her kneel on the polished floorboards she once forced him to scrub raw. He turned her prayers against her, reciting the very scriptures she had used as weapons, only now twisting them into curses. "The last shall be first, and the first last," he whispered, his voice like a blade. He humiliated her, not with blood, but with degradation. Every command inverted the order of her world. The mistress who demanded endless servitude now bent under the weight of another's will. The woman who relished making others beg was now made to plead herself. The house seemed to watch. The portraits on the walls, the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, even the creaking rafters, all bore witness to a reversal of power, so complete it felt unearthly. She trembled, not only at what he made her do, but at the realization that her authority had always been an illusion, paper-thin, fragile, sustained only by fear. And fear had changed its master. Time stretched. What happened within those walls? would never be written in ledgers or whispered to guests over supper. But the enslaved who heard the muffled sounds, who saw her emerge pale and broken before dawn, would never forget. For in their silence, they understood. He had forced her into the unthinkable, and in doing so, he had torn apart the unspoken rules of their world. By morning, she was no longer the same woman. Her hair disheveled, her eyes wild, she could not bring herself to lift her chin as she had always done. She moved like a shadow of herself, clutching her shawl around trembling shoulders, unable to meet the gaze of those who served her. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, cracked when she tried to speak. He, meanwhile, returned to the quarters without a word, no boast, no confession, no outward triumph. But his silence carried weight. Among the enslaved, his act became more than a deed, it became legend. He had reversed the order of the universe, if only for a night. Some whispered it was justice. Others whispered it was madness. But all agreed it was something they had never thought possible. The mistress, humbled, broken, stripped of her crown of cruelty. And though she would never speak of it, the truth lived in her haunted eyes. The mistress who once wielded humiliation as a weapon now carried its scars deep in her soul. Because revenge, when sharp enough, does not just pierce flesh. It pierces identity. It kills who a person thinks they are, and leaves them alive to live with the corpse of their pride. By dawn, the house was no longer the same. The great column still stood, the magnolias still bloomed, but within its walls, something had shifted, a silence deeper than sleep, heavier than morning fog. The mistress did not descend for breakfast. She did not give orders to the kitchen or scold the chambermaids. Instead, she remained hidden in her chambers, her shawl drawn tight, her face pale as chalk. The servants noticed first. They whispered in the halls, trading glances that carried more weight than words. Something had happened. The mistress, who had built her life on control, now trembled when anyone's eyes lingered too long. Her voice, when she spoke at all, cracked and faltered. Even her footsteps, once brisk and commanding, dragged across the floorboards like the shuffle of an old woman. Her husband returned 2 days later, weary from travel and accounts. He noticed her change immediately. "You look unwell," he said, but she brushed him off, insisting she was tired. When he pressed further, her hands shook. She muttered something about insolence among the enslaved, but she would not meet his gaze. He asked no more. Pride stitched her lips shut, for to admit what had occurred would mean confessing that she had been broken by the very people she was supposed to command. The household's overseer, a man loyal only to wages, did notice the undercurrent. He saw how the enslaved avoided her eyes not from fear, but from something else, something close to pity. He saw how the broad-shouldered man carried himself with a quietness that was not submission but certainty. Yet the overseer did not speak. He knew that saying aloud what he suspected would unravel more than just a mistress's reputation. It would unravel the fragile fabric of the plantation itself. So a silence pact formed, unspoken but ironclad. The mistress's humiliation was not recorded in ledgers, not reported in letters, not confessed in church pews. Outwardly, life continued. The fields worked, the bells rang, the carriages came and went. But inside the plantation, a secret gnawed, and secrets, once planted, grow like weeds. The enslaved whispered among themselves at night, trading pieces of the tale until it became more than truth. It became legend. They spoke of how the mistress had been forced into shame, how the order of things had been flipped on its head. They whispered that the broad-shouldered man had not just avenged himself, but all of them. Some said he carried the strength of the ancestors, others that the devil himself guided his hand. Beyond the quarters, the story spread slowly, carefully, carried in coded words along dirt roads and riverbanks. Neighbors never heard it outright, but hints surfaced, Something's not right in that house. She's not the woman she once was. And though no one dared speak it plain, suspicion clung to the plantation like the smell of smoke after a fire. For the mistress, the days that followed were agony. She could not sleep without waking in cold sweats. Every sound at night, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of branches against the shutters, felt like footsteps returning. She grew paranoid, snapping at chambermaids, locking doors that had never before been locked. Her cruelty, once a mask of power, now looked like desperation. Her husband, either blind or unwilling to see, kept to his ledgers and his drink. He told neighbors his wife had taken ill, that her nerves were fragile. But even he began to avoid her gaze at supper, as though he too sensed the fracture running through the heart of their household. The event itself remained unspoken, but its shadow stretched over every corner of the plantation. And the silence was its own confession, because sometimes the most damning truths are not the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones buried under fear, shame, and whispers that never die. Time moved forward, but the wound never closed. On the surface, the plantation appeared unchanged cotton, still swayed in the fields. Carriages rolled down the dirt lanes. The great house still gleamed white against the Alabama sun. But inside its walls, the mistress was no longer the woman she had been. Her cruelty did not vanish, but it transformed. Where once she lashed out with arrogance, now she lashed out with desperation. Every raised voice, every order barked, seemed less like authority and more like a shield against her own fear. Servants whispered that her eyes darted constantly, scanning doorways and shadows, as though expecting someone or something to appear. Her once commanding posture slouched. Her beauty, once spoken of across parlor rooms, withered under the weight of sleepless nights. Her reputation among neighbors faltered. Families who once attended her luncheons noticed her absence from social gatherings. She avoided church, claiming illness, but whispers filled the pews. The mistress is not herself. Some said she was mad, others that she was haunted. A few, leaning close over tea, suggested the most dangerous thought of all, that she had been humbled by her own slaves. None dared say it outright, but suspicion has a way of spreading, invisible and unstoppable. As for the man, his fate was brutal. When fragments of what had happened reached the ears of those who controlled the plantation, they responded with predictable violence. He was whipped, shackled, beaten in ways meant to break both body and spirit. Yet even then, those who watched swore he did not cry out, not once. His silence was louder than screams, heavier than the lash. To the enslaved, it was proof that his will had not been crushed. Though he bore the punishment, he carried something more enduring: legend. Around fires at night, mothers whispered his story to their children as a secret promise that even the powerful could be brought low. Men repeated his name in hushed tones, not as a man, but as a symbol. His revenge was retold not as an act of madness, but as a reckoning. Over time, details blurred. Some said he forced her to kneel until sunrise. Others said he made her beg for mercy before God himself. A few claimed he conjured spirits from across the ocean, ancestors who guided his hand. What mattered was not the facts, but the power of the tale. The mistress, meanwhile, became her own ghost. Even while she lived, she was spoken of in the past tense. She was proud once. She was beautiful once. Her authority withered, because fear is only effective when others believe it. And now, when she raised her voice, it did not instill dread, it invited pity, or worse, contempt. Years later, when the Civil War came and the old order crumbled, the story survived. Freedmen carried it into new towns, reshaping it into folklore that spoke of divine justice. Among white families, it lingered in hushed warnings. That house is cursed. That mistress lost her soul long before the war. And so the tale lived on. not bound by ledgers or church records, but etched into memory, rumor, and fear. The mistress became a cautionary figure, a woman undone by her own cruelty. The enslaved man became more than a man. He became an idea, proof that even in the darkest night, revenge could burn brighter than chains. Because in the South of 1859, where silence was survival and obedience was law, one act of rebellion one unthinkable night echoed louder than an army. Years passed, but the memory of that night refused to fade. The plantation itself seemed marked, as though the land had absorbed the shame and violence that played out within its walls. Visitors spoke of a heaviness in the air, an unnatural stillness that lingered long after the cicadas stopped singing. Even when the war swept across the South and the chains were broken, the story of that mistress and her reckoning clung to the ruins like ivy. Travelers who passed by after emancipation described the great house as a shell of its former glory. The paint peeled, the shutters hung crooked, and the gardens, once meticulously trimmed, grew wild and choked. Locals avoided the property after dark, whispering that strange noises echoed from its hall's footsteps, pacing when no one was there. A woman's sobbing that drifted from the windows, the faint thud of knees striking wooden floors. Some said the mistress never left, that her spirit remained trapped inside, replaying the moment of her humiliation again and again, unable to escape the memory of her own downfall. Others swore it was the enslaved man's presence that lingered, not to haunt, but to remind an eternal witness to a night when the world turned upside down. Generations turned the tale into folklore. Children dared each other to approach the abandoned gates, claiming they could hear whispers in the wind if they listened closely enough. Preachers in nearby towns retold the story as a cautionary tale about sin, pride, and the wages of cruelty. Among freed families, it was repeated as a story of vengeance and justice, proof that even the mightiest oppressors could be brought low. The details changed with each telling. Some said the mistress was driven to madness, clawing at her own skin until death freed her. Others said she lived long into old age, her mind broken, shunned by neighbors who could never look her in the eye. In some versions, the man's revenge was an act of divine justice. In others, it was the devil claiming a soul. But beneath every retelling lay the same truth. She had been forced into the unthinkable, and nothing could ever erase it. By the early 20th century, the plantation house was nothing more than ruins. Farmers who worked nearby spoke of lantern lights flickering in the windows, though no one lived there. A few even claimed to see a woman in tattered finery kneeling in the parlor, her face buried in her hands. And so the story outlived the people who lived it. It became not just history, but haunting an echo carried across decades, reshaped but never silenced. Even now, more than a century later, the question remains, was it justice or was it horror? Was it the breaking of chains or the forging of new ones in the mind of a broken woman? History cannot answer, because history never dared to write this story down. Only whispers kept it alive, but whispers are often louder than words. If you listen closely, if you stand in the ruins of that Alabama plantation on a summer night, with the cicadas singing and the air heavy with heat, you might just hear it. The sob of a mistress, the silence of a man who refused to bow, the echo of a night when power itself was turned on its head, because some acts of revenge do not die. They linger long after the soil has swallowed the bones.